Hi everyone, thanks for joining the first webinar series in building resilient and sustainable communities in Ireland. We are just waiting for all our participants to join, so if you can just bear with us for one moment, we'll begin in a couple of minutes. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our fourth webinar in our summer webinar series on building resilient and sustainable communities in Ireland. My name is Aoife Corcoran, and I'm a Senior Staff Officer here at the Housing Agency, working in the area of sustainable communities. I'm joined today by my colleague Mary Coffey, who's running the back end of the webinar, and by Professor Ken Gibb of the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Excellence. Before we start, I'd like to draw your attention to two things. First of all, we have a questions and answers button at the bottom of your screens. If you have any questions, we would ask that you use the Q&A function and not the chat function. The Q&A function provides you with an option to post your questions anonymously. Secondly, just be aware that this session is being recorded and will be made available on request at a later date. The agenda for today's webinar is as follows. I'll give you a very short introduction to the Housing Agency and the webinar series. Professor Gibb will then present his work on the pre-1919 Glasgow tenement retrofitting demonstration project. And we will then have a Q&A session where we would encourage you to participate and ask any relevant questions you may have. If we can't answer your questions today as part of the webinar, we will make every effort to answer them at a later stage. The Housing Agency, which is hosting this webinar series this month, is a state agency based on Upper Mount Street in Dublin. The Housing Agency, which works with and supports local authorities, approved housing bodies, the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, the private sector, in the delivery of housing and housing services. Our vision is to enable everyone to live in good quality, affordable homes in sustainable communities. It is the Housing Agency's vision for achieving sustainable communities which has inspired this webinar series. The aim of the series is to contribute to and stimulate a discussion on resilience and sustainability topics which are relevant for housing, to raise awareness of the importance of building resilient and sustainable communities in the light of local, national and global shocks to the system, and to create opportunities for collaboration and future projects. This webinar series explores 4 topics which are relevant for housing. It'll look at intergenerational housing and regeneration, nature-based solutions for housing developments, green spaces and urban places, and taking a collaborative approach to retrofitting. On that note, I would like to introduce you to Professor Ken Gibb. Ken is our presenter today. He is a Professor of Housing Economics at the University of Glasgow, where he directs the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence. Ken primarily works in the areas of economics of housing policy, finance and subsidy. He is former managing editor of the Urban Studies Journal and has been actively involved on the board of a major UK housing association, including chairing 3 of its subsidiaries. Ken is a member of the Scottish Housing Policy Delivery Group and is a member of the UK's Housing Affordability Commission. Ken, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to put on my video once we're the right way around. who's being shown on the screen. I guess Mary will just swap us round.
Perfect. Thanks, Ken.
Can you share your screen?
Yeah, I'm just going to try and do that. Okay, so I think that's me ready to go now. So thank you first of all to Evie and Mary for allowing me to have this opportunity to speak about this project today. This is actually the first opportunity I've had to speak about it, so I'm really delighted to have this chance to talk about our project. And it is about collaboration, as you'll see. So before I start getting into the substance today, I'd like to say a little bit about the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, which should just take up a slide. So please bear with me as I do a bit of promo work. So let me just see if I can move this along. So CASH, Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, was formed in 2017. It's funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, the Arts and Humanities Research Council and Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And it's a 5-year funding package, which is probably the largest investment in housing research in the UK in a generation. Core teams in Glasgow, but we have overall a consortium of 13 institutions with strong contingents in Glasgow, Sheffield, Cardiff, but also the Chartered Institute of Housing and the Royal Town Planning Institute. And it's a big virtual centre. There are 29 co-investigators and about 14, 15 research staff. We cover all of the UK. We have bases in all parts of the UK. We're multidisciplinary in our focus. And our objective really is to embed evidence into housing policy and practice and to further and support knowledge exchange and mobility. And alongside that, where it's strategically relevant to our objectives, we also bid for other projects, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So if you want to know more about CASH, we can talk about that later, but also do have a look at our website. I think if you just type housing evidence into Google, you'll find us fine, and there's lots and lots of outputs and material there. So what am I going to try and do when I'm talking today? First of all, I want to tell you a little bit about the urban tenement context, particularly in Scotland and especially in Glasgow. The key problems and policy initiatives recently that have taken place in the kind of low carbon challenge kind of area, and also the interesting context that we in Glasgow are going to host COP26. It was originally going to be this summer, but it's now been postponed because of COVID to November 2021. And that's a very important thing for the city, and the city clearly wants to promote its climate change, its emergency response credentials. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe the project today that we're doing, the sense of its underlying theory of change as a retrofit demonstration project. And I think also its replicability to a city scale. Indeed, the council talks about trying to develop a Glasgow housing standard for retrofit of tenements in particular. And in doing that, I'm going to also try to set out the partnership and collaborative natures of this project, which is absolutely fundamental to it, as we'll see, and will be fundamental to trying to spread the learning as we go along. And also, I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges of the project and how we hope to overcome them. So that's really the objectives of today. So a sensible place to start, I suppose, is to ask, where did the project come from? So there was a climate emergency call run by the Scottish Funding Council last autumn. The Scottish Funding Council funds higher education and further education in Scotland. It's the equivalent of HEFCE in England. So they are the people who fund our students, pay for fees, they support universities, they do some research funding as well, but they're not really known for doing research in the way that they're known for supporting the teaching aspect, the educational aspects of higher education. But they put forward this climate emergency call and asked for said they could fund 2 projects, both of approximately £250,000 each in pounds. And we think about a dozen or 15 people bid for these projects, and we managed to secure one of them. With our project beginning at the end of February, just before COVID emergency really hit home. So what exactly are we talking about? We're talking about the retrofit of one single tenement block. This block is pre-1919, so it's part of the traditional older tenemental stock of the inner south side of Glasgow. It encompasses 8 one-bedroom flats. These were owned in the private rented sector, but were purchased as a block by Southside Housing Association. That gives them complete control over an empty property, and therefore the scope for a more thoroughgoing retrofit is much more possible, and that will help us also to do more interesting things, which could hopefully help maximize the shared learning that goes on with that. So this, for me personally, was a really interesting experience. I had no background experience in this area whatsoever. I'm an applied economist who works in housing. I've done many projects over the years, but I've never worked in anything like this before. And what we had to do was, in the space of 2 weeks from a standing start, bring together a partnership, a collaboration team, write a bid, have it quality assured, get the funding all sorted out, get in-kind support, submit the bid. And we did all that in 2 weeks, having never met any of these people before, and we managed to succeed. So a good question to start with, I suppose, is why did this bid succeed? I think it is immensely practical. There's no getting away from it, as we'll see shortly. The scale of tenemental building in Glasgow is colossal. The problems with it are colossal, as is the whole challenge of trying to reduce the carbon emissions from it. So it's a massive scale as well. The shared learning and knowledge mobilisation is potentially really significant. There's real economic potential and opportunity, because clearly if you're going to try to retrofit over a period of time tens of thousands of units of tenemental housing, then there's an awful lot of construction work attached to that, an awful lot of building professional work attached to that. We also had, as I say, COP26 around the corner, and all of the parties want to be seen to be doing something really significant. And this really would be a significant thing if we could find a scalable way of doing this kind of work. And I think also we were successful because we were able to demonstrate a proper collaborative partnership between the private sector, the public sector, and academics as well. So all good stuff that got us funded. So I think a simple way of trying to explain what we're doing is a kind of logic model from a theory of change about what we think we're about. So let me just take you briefly through the kind of the needs we were facing, the inputs into it, the outputs, and the impacts or the outcomes. So first of all, of course, we have a carbon emissions reduction target, really challenging target to probably reduce the emissions from the existing housing stock of something like 70 to 90% in no more than about 20 years. Government is completely committed to that. City Council is completely committed to achieving that. The difficulty is that Glasgow is replete with a very large volume of pre-1919 tenemental housing. So these account for something like 70,000 units in the city. There are probably a quarter of all housing in Scotland is tenemental, though it's not all pre-1919. The pre-1919 stock tends to be sandstone. It's very porous. Carbon just leaks out of it. So it's problematic and needs to be, needs to be a major piece of work to do something about it. And that's important for a number of reasons. Partly it's important because it's really iconic for a city like Glasgow. It's what many people who visit Glasgow think of the city as, is the tenements. The tenements have also been undergone major renovation and ownership change through community-based housing associations who now own much of that tenemental stock. But of course, it's also owned by private landlords, by homeowners in parts of the city. Home owning in a pre-1919 tenement is a really high quality housing outcome. So these are important stocks spread across the income distribution by housing tenure, by neighbourhood as well. And we have this problem that not only is there multiple ownership, which makes trying to deal with the common repairs and the common carbon reduction retrofit challenging, it can also be very expensive. So how do you fairly and equitably and efficiently distribute the cost? So these are the kind of challenges we're facing. And it should be said there are also other common repairs problems. The housing stock was largely upgraded when the housing associations took it over. A large part of it was upgraded in the 80s and 90s, but it's now beginning to look tired, and some of it needs a lot of work as well. So that's the kind of sense of the scale of the problem that Glasgow faces. It wants to retain, from a heritage point of view, and also because it's a very efficient form of housing, it wants to retain as much of that high quality pre-1919 stock as it can, but recognise that that's a really challenging thing to do. So let's talk a little bit about the partners who are involved. So there's kind of two academic inputs. There's myself and my colleagues in CASH, in the Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, but also a building professional academic architect at the University of Strathclyde, Tim Smith, who is Tim Sharp, who's an important figure in how we think about building performance and such like, and has been a great colleague, and is somebody I didn't know before we put this bid together. Southside Housing Association own the property, and they were the ones who actually initiated the notion of bidding for the research. We're working with an eminent Scottish team of conservation architects. We're working with the City Council, who underpin the funding of the whole enterprise, the actual construction works I'm talking about. There's also a major Scottish construction contractor, CCG, who we're obviously working with closely, and then the evaluation, the research is being funded by the Scottish Funding Council as well. So that's the kind of partnership. We'll talk more about that in a minute. We're doing a number of things. The actual outputs or deliverables are, first of all, from a construction point of view, we're going to do this retrofit demonstration project, show what can be done in an 8-unit tenement property in the south side of Glasgow. We are going to evaluate that project, and that's really what the demonstration work that we are funded for is going to do. That's about the building performance, about the carbon reduction. It's also about the finance and economic effectiveness of the policy. We're also going to scale it up and look at policy options, both in delivery and funding terms, for the city in particular as a whole, but also for Scotland, I suppose. And also in that respect, we're going to spend a lot of our time over the next year or 15 months thinking about sharing lessons, training, behavioural change, all the things that are needed to make the most of the retrofit work. And so we're hoping there are going to be some significant outcomes from this, applying lessons, educating behavioural change on the part of the residents who occupy these properties, trying to sustain a large part of the tenement sector, showing as maximising the variation in what we do in the demonstration project in order to maximise the learning that can be achieved. Clearly, there are all manner of tenements in the city in terms of size and condition and ownership, and we have to think about how can we maximise what we can learn from this one property, as it were. So I hope that gives you a flavour of what we're trying to do. I think it's also worth saying that we have a very specific kind of approach to evaluation. The next slide tries to pick that up. I think we're really doing 5 different pieces of evaluation. And the first one, the one in the centre, is where we start. I have colleagues I've worked with in Glasgow for a number of years who are very keen on the notion of evaluability assessment. And what this is about, for those of you who don't know, is it's an attempt to where you have a collaborative process going forward, or multiple stakeholders involved in a research evaluation. You need to get everybody to buy into the evaluation and understand what it's trying to do. And in our case, we also need to get people to understand that there are a number of different disciplinary evaluations going on. We have building performance, we have finance, we have the whole scaling up debate and the replicability debate. So we are actually just beginning to go through this process of the evaluability assessment, where we're going to try and get everybody to understand the theory of change that underpins all of this, and also recognise the value and the requirements of each separate evaluation process, so that hopefully we will maximise the collaborative partnership in so doing. So there are 4 of these elements. I've talked already about a couple of them. We'll say a bit more. Demonstration project, we need to work out what it costs, why it costs it, whether it's good value for money. We need to compare the theory and practice of the building performance change that arises from the carbon reduction work that's done through the retrofit itself. In our bid, we estimated on a theoretical desktop base how much carbon reduction we hoped there would be. It's obviously important that we monitor what actually happens, both post-construction, pre-change, post-construction, but also once the residents are actually in situ, because we're going to have eight households as social tenants living in the property come the end of the construction project. Third, we are scaling up, of course, so we need to think about what the funding and delivery options are out there, and there's actually been a really good report published just a couple of weeks ago by the Green Design Council, which lists about 25 different models of trying to fund retrofit carbon reduction projects in the construction sector. The fourth quadrant, I think in many ways is one of the most interesting things we're doing, where we are, in a sense, inhabiting an action research project, because we're trying to capture all the decisions that are made over the construction project throughout its life, try to understand why they were made, what the trade-offs were, what the decision criteria were, which actually led to certain decisions being made, because we think that's tremendously valuable for another tenement, another housing association, another combination of owners trying to make such a project work. We can provide a lot of information about the real-time decisions that have to be made and the consequences of those decisions. So we actually have quite a complex and multifaceted evaluation project. This is my favourite slide, of course. The architects have done us this nice kind of exploded diagram of the property. So this is Nidri Street, which is in the south side of Glasgow, in between two neighbourhoods, one called Govan Hill, one called Strathbungo. It's actually directly adjacent to a mainline train station. The train station is actually literally next door to it, which is fantastic from an accessibility point of view, but it is in our south side. So what this tries to capture is kind of 4 of the 8 units in the property. They're all quite small. They go from front to back of the building, but they actually are quite small. They're a single bedroom property, so they're either for one person or a couple. Generally speaking, there's going to have to be some refurbishment work done, which will change the space within the building by moving some of the bathrooms around a wee bit. A couple of them and a couple of the floors are really very small, so that's got to be changed. But you get a sense of the kind of work that's going to be done. There's going to be external wall insulation at the back and at the gable end. It's a gable end tenement. There's a lot of work being done around the joists on the first floor, because one of the problems is that the joists directly link into the external wall, and that's, as I understand it, a cause of some problems in terms of wood decay in the building. There's a lot of thought being gone into the mechanical ventilation and heat recovery in the bathrooms, and also a kind of heat recovery process with wastewater. There's going to be treble glazed insulation of the windows and of glazing of the windows, and there's going to be some minor changes to the windows themselves, creating bigger windows rather than smaller windows, for instance. And I should say that not all of these decisions are finalised. There is some choices still to be sorted out. I'll come back to that in a minute, but I hope that gives you a feeling or a sense of what the property is like. It's not in a conservation area, I should say that, but that doesn't mean it doesn't face some planning challenges where planners feel that there are some things you shouldn't do to the tenement. I'll come back to that in a minute. So that gives you a sense of what the project looks a bit like. So I think there are a number of pretty substantial challenges that we have to try to overcome. And the first, in some respects, the biggest, is COVID-19. We had our launch of the project on the last day of February. And then within a couple of weeks, it was clear that the construction industry was going to close down. And now several of the partners have furloughed people. Academics are all working from home. The housing association people, they've furloughed some staff. The construction industry is kind of stopped, and they'll be furloughing there as well. We are just coming out of that just now, and we've got a phased recovery in the construction industry, a phased return to work, and that's just underway now. So our project should have been, 3 or 4 months into its life now, and effectively everything has been done on a desk-based basis instead. Although I meet with the other key principal stakeholders of the project every week, And we've actually done a lot of work, a lot of design work and a lot of first principles thinking and a lot of tweaking and tinkering with the project, which has been very useful. Second challenge that's going on, and I should say also finally about COVID, that means that our expected end date will have to be pushed back into 2021, and we're in discussions with our funders over that. Secondly, there's a point I think that's very important, which is path dependency. We know that existing housing stock is problematic from a carbon reduction point of view, and critically it depends on what you have to deal with. You know, these are very old buildings. They were built in a very traditional style, and they leak carbon. Then you've got to deal with which way they face, the wet, windy climate of a city like Glasgow, and you have to confront all of those things at the same time. So what you do is contingent on what you've got to work with. And that's very important when we start to think about scaling up and replicability. There will be some general principles, but a lot of things are simply not scalable because they depend on those kind of environmental and historical factors. Third challenge, and a more kind of general challenge for the project and for replication as well, is the kind of challenges always brought about by preventative spending. Clearly, a successful retrofit reduces the cost to society, to citizens, to the public sector in the future. And we all kind of favour prevention and preventative spending as a way to avoid symptomatic or failure spending, as some people call it. But of course, it's very hard in a world of silos and different spending departments and different interests, all of which are often, you know, all of which are legitimate. It's hard to, you know, to make the preventative goal as high a priority as some of us feel it ought to be. And in any area where prevention is so prominent as it is with retrofit, that's going to be a challenge. The other big challenge, and one that we can't escape in Scotland, is the incentive compatible nature of how do you make the need for somebody to pay at least part of the cost of a retrofit compatible with their own incentives? How do you drive them to do that in terms of their own self-interest? And that's quite hard when you deal with owner-occupiers, with private landlords, but the fact that social landlords also have many conflicting burdens that they have to face. You know, they are constrained like we all are. So that is a problem and a challenge that we have to face, and that's how we have to think about designing the way in which we might build up a bigger policy which is replicated across the city. As I said earlier, there are also fundamental questions with tenements about common works. There are problems with common works. We have a factoring services in tenemental housing. It's not by any stretch of the imagination complete. There are works that don't get done, and part of that's because of these multiple ownership challenges. So fundamentally, all of these things are about affordability. How much will this cost people? How can you stretch out the costs? How can you make it more affordable for the different actors involved? And the other big area I think that has become more and more apparent to me is that the decisions we make in individual properties for retrofit are ultimately about trade-offs. They're about what works technically. They're about what's the most efficient way to achieve your goal regarding, say, affordability or, say, affordable warmth, or perhaps simply in carbon reduction. You have to overcome institutional constraints as well. Politics, local or national politics, sometimes politics with a small p, the planning system, the heritage lobby, etc. And ultimately, it's the second best set of outcomes. You do the best you can given the constraints, and you have to kind of present a kind of quality assurance or audit or option appraisal as why you've made those decisions. And that's been really brought home by a problem or an issue we have around the heating systems to be used in these properties. So I don't know how true this is in Ireland, but in the UK and in Scotland, we're phasing out gas boiler systems. In the tenement at the moment, they have 8 gas boilers. They are comparatively efficient in terms of delivering the energy that they do, but they don't have a long life because they have to be phased out and they won't be replaced. The other options that are open to us are things like electric boilers, heat pumps and air pumps. The local area where the tenement is rules out heat pumps. earth, digging into the ground type of heat pumps. Air pumps cause a planning problem because they are noisy and they will basically completely change the rear facing side of the building. Electric boilers, from the view of the builders and architects, are the least efficient option, and you lose some of the water recovery benefits of the gas boiler system. So you have a number of trade-offs with what you're going to do. So we have decided that the best thing to do is to do 3 different heating systems to try to maximize the learning that we get from that. So we're going to have 2 gas boilers on the ground floor, and the other 3 floors will include a number of electric boilers and air pumps. And we need to try and get that through planning, obviously. So that's just one example of the trade-offs you have to make. But we've not just got the criteria of delivering the most efficient system we can. We're also trying to get as much shareable information as we can. So as I say, I think there are some things do scale up across the stock, and we think we'll have lots of lessons, but there's also things that won't scale up because of that path dependency issue. So I've gone on quite a long time there, but I think these are the real important technical challenges we face. But we are ultimately optimistic, and this is really my final slide, which is the team on the day of the launch. And it's worth just pointing out a number of people there. The person second on the left is the chief architect. The person fourth on the left is the director of the construction company. Behind him on his left is the director of the housing association, and behind him on the left is the architectural professor from Strathclyde. In front of myself and the director of the housing association, the man in the suit is the Scottish Government Minister for Economic Innovation, who's particularly interested in scaling up the low carbon economy. And next to the minister on his left, the woman in the green coat is the leader of Glasgow City Council, who is very, very much on message and very supportive of what we're trying to do. So we will try and find a way to work all these questions out and to make this demonstration project work, and hopefully do as much as we can. Where that photograph's taken is the back close of the tenement. The ground floor's closed up, but before the launch meeting, we actually went upstairs into two of the flats and got a sense of what life will be like there. So I hope you found that an interesting wander through a project which is still going on right now, and it still has a degree of uncertainty about it, but it's a very, very exciting, and I would say probably more than any other project I've been involved in the last 3 or 4 years, the tremendous amount of interest from the wider world about this work, and that can only help us, I think. So I'll stop at that point, and I'll turn off my slides if I can. Thank you.
Thanks a million for that, Ken. I'm very interested, and I can see we've a lot of questions coming in there for you. I'll just start, I suppose, with the first question that came in. What do you think are the main advantages of undertaking a retrofitting project in collaboration with a local authority, an approved housing body, the construction sector, and academic partners?
I think it's just a necessity, really. I think we found ourselves, bidding for a real project which already existed, and it of course already was a collaboration. So what became really important was to get everybody on side on the same page and willing to kind of bear the risks that this kind of thing might have. I don't mean that in a financial sense, but more that you don't always know where an evaluation is going to go. You don't know what you're going to turn up. You don't know what conclusions you're going to reach at. So you have to get that kind of pre-commitment on people to do that, and I think they've been great. And as I say, I have this weekly meeting with my colleagues, and I find that tremendously helpful. I didn't know any of them a few months ago. So far, it's working extremely well, and I can't imagine any other way that we could do this. I suppose there are evaluations very kind of contractual, transactional, where you get wheeled in to do an evaluation and you get wheeled out again, and you don't have that level of trust. But this is so much better, and also because we're actually developing and evolving the demonstration project as we go along, and that's so doing it on that basis is really tremendous.
It's very interesting. And Ken, just one of the participants asked, they were talking about your point on COVID as a challenge. They just want to know, could you explain maybe a little bit more how it might impact the project? I know you were saying like timeline might be pushed out, but I suppose, do you see any other impacts coming from COVID on the project? Or
yeah, I suppose, I mean, there's a whole set of things. There will be delays of several months as a result. We had hoped to do the funded part of this research in the year 2020. I think we're going to have to push it into 2021, and we're having some discussions with our funder about that. I can't imagine it'll be a problem. It's not going to cost any more money. It's just going to be an unavoidable delay. It's a kind of act of God, isn't it, in these sorts of things. That also means that the tenants will be later coming into the properties, and that's quite significant. So we're really keen to have some time to monitor carbon reductions and use of energy once they're in the property. And we plan to pilot some survey and training work with them about how to use the properties in the most cost-effective and carbon-reducing way that they can. So that's important. I mean, I think also thirdly, we're going to have a recession, and we know that's kind of emergent. So that raises a number of just the challenge of what's going to happen to some of the public funding, which is not direct but indirectly related to what happens to the housing sector and the housing market. So there's that kind of slight unease that the broader picture is going to be a bit more challenging, which is never the best or easiest way to do things. Though, as I said, I don't think that affects us directly. It's more an indirect thing. So, and also the other thing that we don't know is we just don't know quite what the future pattern of COVID is going to be. If there's a second spike and that leads to further closures of the construction sector, etc., then that all causes further unknowns.
There's a couple of questions about if the tenements was empty, Ken, before you started work, but I think it was. But we've got a question in there kind of saying that, I suppose, with it being an empty property, it makes it easier to deal with. Do you think it's more challenging to deal with obviously properties that are occupied, or what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, well, that's right, and we've been talking about the different kind of options there. So, yeah, I mean, we're very fortunate, and this is a demonstration project, remember. So we're trying. What's important in this is the freedom to make change to the whole property, to all 8 units, all 4 floors, and then to bring the association's new tenants in, and then to monitor their kind of how they use the units. But of course, in reality, we would not be faced with having an empty property. There'd be questions of decanting people. There'd be questions of whether some of the works can be done without having to move people out temporarily, and all of those kind of factors have to be taken into account. So we'll be able to speak to that once we've got the data from an empty property. We can, of course, talk to people who are involved in these things, and who be the letting agent or people involved with common repairs and such. Like we can get a sense of what the implications of that are. But yeah, we're very aware that from the scaling up point of view, it's a different task if you have people living in the properties originally.
Yeah, definitely is if you've got different tenants to deal with. There's a couple of questions here, Ken, I suppose, on other works that you might be consider doing while you're doing the retrofitting. Like, so are there other work plans?
Yes.
And then an interesting question on how the project would meet the needs of an aging population for the next 100 years. So is that something that's been taken into consideration, that we're all getting a bit older, or our society will be getting a little bit older?
Absolutely. Well, of course, yeah. I mean, they're two very good points, and there's no doubt that tenement living cannot be for everybody, because there aren't lifts. There are 4 stairs and a single close. In this case, our tenants tend to be 3-story or 4-story, or very, very rarely 5 stories. So they don't have lifts. So they rule certain groups of less able people, less mobile people, out of living higher up. So that's obviously an issue. That's a limitation. So that's. Sorry, I lost the other question there. What was the other question?
It was just that, is there any other works being planned, I suppose, to modernise?
Sorry, yes, yeah.
Rather than.
Yeah. So to put this in a broader context, as I said at the beginning, Glasgow radically changed its tenemental stock in the 70s, 80s and 90s by shifting largely from private renting to social renting in the stock, and community-based housing associations took over that stock, and almost always they received 2 lots of grant funding. They received grants from the council to take over the stock unimproved. Then they got a second set of grants later on to improve the stock. So a lot of them were remodeled internally. So for instance, a lot of these tenants didn't have indoor toilets, didn't have bathrooms as we would understand them. So they all now do. So all of that kind of remodeling went on. A lot of the properties were made larger because some of them were very, very small. As I was kind of sort of hinting at before, a lot of that property, now a whole generation has passed since that investment, and it's starting to need more reinvestment in it. So I think ideally you'd see investment in the fabric and the modernising of the stock alongside the retrofit, and certainly that's what we're planning to do in the demonstration project. There is quite a lot of refurbishment going on. So some of the bathrooms are too small and they've been made a lot larger, and there's other work done. There's work being done to change the size of windows and such like. So that will have a substantial effect. Again, when you get to properties which have got multiple ownership, it's clearly much harder to do that. You need a lot more resource. So it still comes back to affordability and funds. And obviously that's true of a housing association as well, but at least they can work on a collective basis if they own the whole if they own the whole block.
Ken, just coming back to the residents, will there be a range of different kind of age groups and types of residents, I suppose, to evaluate how they cope with different types of renovations or retrofitting, or has the tenants for the project been selected?
The tenants haven't been selected yet. I don't really know that much about the detail of it, but I presume that they will be people who meet the criteria on the register, the waiting list that the association works with. But I think we're expecting them to be single people or couples. But there's no sense by which they would be, of working age, older or younger, or what their circumstances are. But they'll be social tenants, so they'll be housed according to priority need in some way.
Okay, brilliant. We have a question in, Ken, from one of our listeners. How easy has it been to deal with the planners and heritage groups?
It's part of the trade-offs that we face. I said at the beginning that it's not in a conservation area, but there's still building control and planners still have lines that they take and policies that they hold about any tenement building. So we want to externally insulate the rear of the building, and that's currently in debate with planning. I mentioned earlier also that there are issues about the use of air pumps. So that's something that we expect planning to take issue with us over. So we recognise that, and we're trying to make the case that we're a demonstration project and it's a pilot for other things, and that we should have some leeway. Similarly with heritage groups, we are aware that people will challenge particularly changes to the front of the building, which is the kind of visual part of the building. And that's one of these where we're not doing external wall insulation at the front. The red sandstone will be improved and protected, and there'll be internal wall insulation there. But that's quite a different thing to contend with. So we need to recognise that with an awful lot of 100-year-old plus buildings which dominate whole neighbourhoods, then there will be that will be a challenge, and that's part of the things we have to factor into how we might fund and deliver this model on a bigger scale. So these are real issues, but we will discuss and work them through, and we're working very closely with the council across a number of different departments, and we'll continue to do so.
That's probably one of the joys of the project being a collaboration, is that you're working jointly with them, so you're trying to iron out different projects, different projects, different problems with them. We've loads of questions in here. I just have another one there, just as we're talking about the council, Ken. Is there an aspiration that this approach gets adopted by the council and expanded as part of their housing projects?
I think so. I mean, just to be clear, people may not know about Glasgow. Glasgow doesn't have any council housing. Glasgow sold all its council housing off to the Glasgow Housing Association. So the City Council is more of an investor and developer of social housing. So Glasgow receives funding from Scottish Government and it allocates its funds out to housing associations. So it plays more of a kind of investment role as well as a regulatory role. But it also runs the housing strategy for the city. So that's why they're interested in the idea of a Glasgow housing standard, that if people are going to renovate tenemental property, it should meet this kind of standard. We hope the demonstration project will be part of, showing what can be done with that kind of idea of a retrofit standard for the existing stock. So this council, as I understand it, the council's already made quite good strides on standards for new housing in Glasgow. So they're keen to do this. There's that old there's an old line that many people trot out about the existing housing stock, that in Britain and in Scotland, 4/5 of the housing that will exist in 2040 is already there now. So existing housing stock dominates, and we obviously need to find ways forward with it. And the council, I think, also recognises just that iconic importance of tenemental housing, that we need to take that forward. So the more they put a stamp on it and the more they support and promote the idea, the better.
And just kind of taking the next question on that line, is that some of the participants here asking, like, will there be guidance documents developed on the findings of the project which could be available to designers to refer to? So I know you were talking about your big plan for dissemination and things like that. So
yes, indeed. We plan to hold a number of conferences. We plan to be involved. We don't know how yet, because nobody does, in the COP26. We will be publishing a lot of materials. We're keen to construct materials to help people with that kind of educational thing about how to get the most out of the property, and also to allow landlords to understand better what they can do. That they can save money in their fuel bills, etc. If they make the most of it, etc. So no, I mean, I would say probably about a quarter of all our work is simply disseminating what we find out and the lessons that we've learned. So we will be sharing, because we've certainly got a target market across the whole of Scotland, because all of urban Scotland is significantly tenemental. So that's important.
Yeah, and I'd say there'd be huge interest in your work here in the Irish context as well, because it's a very innovative project, and I don't think we have one similar here in the country. We just have another kind of question here on collaborations, Ken. Just someone has asked, are you linked to any international benchmarks? And they're thinking in particular of retrofit of tenements that have been undertaken in France by different.
We are linked to Passive House, the Passive House group. So they supported our original proposal. We are, as I said, we have these trade-offs that we have to face. So the actual mix of what we end up with may not be where we started, but we certainly are going to work in partnership as much as we can. And that the architects we work with, they're closely attached to that. They are a kind of conservation heritage architects. They're very, and they're very kind of strong and have strong credentials in the retrofit world. So we take our lead from them, to be honest.
Perfect. And I know you have to nip off at 10 to 1, Ken, so I'll just kind of finish up with one question. What advice would you give to anyone listening today who would be interested in establishing a collaborative project such as the Tenement project?
Well, I think, going back to the kind of first question you asked, I think you obviously need to have the right partners involved, and need to have a degree of trust and a willingness to experiment and innovate. We kind of landed on this project, as I say, it was a research funding opportunity, and the people came to us, and then we built the project up collaboratively. I know that not all collaborations always work. They don't work the way that they don't finish where they started. and we may not finish where we've started, but so far it's been an evolving, very positive story. So I guess you need to have trust. You need to keep working at it, and you know, you need to have the opportunities you hoped you were going to have, and so far we have, and it's been going well. And if anything, I think the sense of collaboration grows all the time.
Okay, well, brilliant. Look, Ken, from the Housing Agency, I would like to really thank you for your time. Very interesting presentation. I have lots more questions there for you. For anyone who has questions, hasn't been answered, if you would like to email them into myself, my email address should have been on the invitation. I'd like to thank Mary Coffey for looking after our webinar in the back end, and thanks to everyone for listening and joining us. This is our first, as I said, in our webinar series. We have another webinar next Wednesday at the same time, looking at intergenerational housing for regeneration in our Irish towns and villages. As again, thank you very much, Ken, and I'll let you go.
Thank you.
And thanks for talking to us.
Okay.
Okay. Goodbye,
See you all
everyone.
again.
Thanks for
Bye,
being.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.